Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on AI and human behavior, focusing on adoption. My name is Michael Hallsworth. I'm the Chief Behavioural Scientist at BIT. And I want to start today by just sort of giving you an overview of what we're going to cover. So first of all, I'm going to find out how to share my screen. There we are. It's worked. Okay, so 5 things we want to talk about today. The first one is why behavioral science matters for AI. Why should we care about human behavior, and what does behavioral science have to offer? Second thing is we're going to be talking about what do we mean by adopting AI in the first place. I'm going to be talking about maybe some of the differences between shallow and deep adoption using the terminology that we developed in our recent report on AI. And third, we're going to talk about, well, what are some of the barriers to adoption? What can behavioral science say about the reasons people do or don't adopt AI tools and kind of use them creatively in their jobs? Then talk about some of the potential ways we can increase adoption or tackle some of these issues around AI adoption using behavioral science. And then finally, how would you actually implement some of these ideas in practice? Just some suggestions there. Okay. Why does behavioral science matter? Why are we talking about it right now from this particular angle? Well, it comes from this insight that, there has been a vast amount of attention spending, organizational change focused on, in particular recently, generative AI. And I'm not saying that human behavior hasn't been part of the picture here. It has, but I don't think it's got the attention that it deserves. Questions like, how is AI changing our behavior? How is it affecting our trust, both in AI and in others? How are social norms changing as a result of AI? And how should we respond to all this? Organizations are grappling with these very human questions that are being created by the rise and the accessibility of AI. And so you come to the conclusion that we're going to fail to embrace the potential of AI if we don't think carefully and in an evidence-based way about human behavior. I think from another perspective, there are various risks that may come about from AI if we don't think about how to mitigate them based on what we know about human behavior. We, as an organization, have approached this in terms of 4 A's: augment, adopt, align, and adapt. That's the title of a report we put out about 4 months ago. Behavioral science can make a difference in those 4 ways. Very briefly, augment is about using insights from behavioral science to design AI better. And there's a long history here around, in terms of neural networks, the clues in the name in terms of the relationship to how humans think. And I think there's still plenty that behavioral science can offer in terms of how, for example, new AI agents are going to behave. Adopt is the topic that we're going to be talking about today, so I'll leave that for now. Align is about how does AI, how does it affect our behavior? How can it be aligned with our goals, our values, the way we behave? How is it affecting us day to day in the use that we have of AI? And then adapt is about zooming out. How should society evolve to meet some of these challenges created by AI? Thinking about how do we shape our collective kind of human AI future. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about adopt. And I think we should start by saying, what do we mean by adoption? And what do we mean by AI? I hinted at this just now, but the actual practices that we mean by AI have been shifting, particularly over the last 10 years. I'm going to make very crude distinctions here between machine learning, generative AI, and agentic AI, just at a high level. So you can think about machine learning, which has been around for us a while now. It focuses on pattern detection, algorithms taking in structured data, and making predictions like, is this person likely to be a high performer? Is this person likely to default on a loan, for example? it trains on data to find rules that explain the data. Then we have generative AI, which focuses on content creation. You put in text, like prompts, for example. Many of the large language models like ChatGPT, Claude, and so on in this space. Images, text go in, and new content comes out, is generated. And this is based around predicting the next token, is called. So neural networks in transformer architecture saying what's likely to come next, and then creating the next part of the picture or sentence. But then also recently, the rise of agentic AI, which is basically where you're asking the AI to do something, to actually behave in a particular way, to achieve an objective, and you find out, does it do that objective? So there the AI is planning, acting, using tools, and even self-correcting. And so you can see this kind of progression from learning rules to creating content to executing tasks at a very high level. So we can mean quite different things. And I mention this because recently the increase in the sophistication of agentic AI, we may soon be in a world where many people are using agents to do things for them. That raises a whole set of new questions about human behavior as well, and the behavior of those agents. But then also the question is, if we're talking about what is AI, what is adoption? I think things are changing, but there has been a tendency to sort of talk about adoption as a bit of a binary. So sort of a yes or no, are you using AI? It's obviously not a switch that is just flipped on. We talk about this more as a continuum, from shallow to deep adoption. And you can see in much of the data that there is quite a big difference actually between, first of all, have people, investigated AI? Those are the bars in the darker blue. Have they piloted it, and have they actually successfully implemented it? But then also all those bars are lower for the question of, are you using it in a specific and embedded way, rather than just sort of sprayed on the surface, maybe consulting a chatbot? Are you instead actually building it into the way you run your processes? Like, for example, the way that you sell tickets in your ticketing platform. Is that actually integrated into your business as usual, if you like? And, to make this a bit more real, we try and make this distinction, although it's a continuum between these different kind of actions. You might have a distinction between low stakes tasks like summarizing emails, writing text and so on, or deep adoption as in your actual decision-making processes are different because of AI. So I won't go through all of this, but just to say that's the kind of distinction we're making. And we think it matters because there's evidence that, you get greater returns from that deeper adoption. Maybe that's not surprising, but you can see this in terms of studies like the one in Denmark that looks at AI adoption among 25,000 workers. They didn't find any significant impact on wages or hours worked. And they concluded that there are some things that may be quicker with a chatbot, but you actually don't increase productivity or marginal issues unless you adapt workflows accordingly. So you need to actually think and plan and build these things into the flow of work in your organization. And that's what Google did, just in terms of this randomized control trial. They found that if it was well integrated into the task flow, it cut the task time needed by about 20%. So there are gains here that can be made from shallow and deep adoption. As an organization, we've tried to make our own efforts to do this in terms of looking at the role of research. How can it be improved? How can we do literature reviews quicker? What is the trade-off between speed and accuracy when you're trying to research something with AI or with humans? And we've got some data on that. Obviously, enhancing interventions. What are the effects on behavior if you design interactions between humans and AI? What government or public sector functions could be enhanced in that way? And then also looking at our core recruitment processes, we use a kind of online blind recruiting process, and we look to see we inserted some AI-generated applications for people to rate, and we looked to see how they were rated, to draw conclusions about how does AI compare to human candidates in that kind of core activity that we use. Okay, so we're talking about what is AI and what is adoption. So then what is the problem? Because looking at things at a high level, you might think that there is no issue because ChatGPT and other forms of generative AI have got hundreds of millions of users, faster adoption than so many other technologies that have come about. The fact that LLMs, large language models, can be accessed through just speaking to them, through normal language, doesn't require code or anything, has been a game changer. But I think underneath those headlines, there are a bunch of problems and unanswered questions. So first thing to think about, obviously, is adoption for what? What are you asking AI to do? What are you hoping, what are you directing it towards in your organization? And I think a really good framework for this was actually in Harvard Business Review a couple of weeks ago, which talks about the difference between tacit knowledge and explicit data and the cost of errors being low or high. And you can see this here, that they come up with some differing segments as a result in terms of when AI adoption may be more or less risky and people may welcome it more or less, and when it should, where it should be targeted potentially. There's a particular thing I want to flag here, which is that many of the times we talk about human in the loop, as in AI is brought in to perform a task and then humans oversee it. The big question, I suppose, is do humans want to do that? And in what way? And what control do they have? What agency? Because there's evidence that people do not want to be what's called a reverse centaur. So to explain this, in AI, a centaur is often used as this term that you have a human being who's assisted by a machine. So you have a human head on a strong and tireless body. And I used Gemini to demonstrate some images here of what this might look like. But the reverse centaur is basically when you have the machine in charge and it's being assisted by a sort of frail, vulnerable human being. Consider if you are, you have to drive the delivery van because a human has to do that, but the AI is watching you in your van all the time. People don't like that situation at all. There's a danger that they feel like they are the moral crumple zone. This is another term that's used where they're just there to take the blame when something goes wrong, because they're the nearest human operator to blame. And this issue of like, who do you blame and what is accountability is kind of core to these questions. So human behavior there, is really matters in terms of people's willingness and wish to be the, if you like, the reverse centaur, the human in the loop. And this goes to the other question of what do we want? What do humans kind of want AI to do? Or what do they prefer or feel most comfortable with it doing? I think a nice framework for understanding this is this one, which in some ways is similar to the 2x2 I talked about earlier. But here it talks about the degree of ambiguity involved in a task, whether it's something that you can be definitively right or wrong about, and that's the top to bottom axis. And then the other one is, how is it relevant to your identity? How is it most relevant, and do you feel it's like personal to you? And so what you end up with is in situations down in the left-hand bottom corner, you have things that people don't consider particularly relevant to them, and there's low ambiguity. And a lot of this is maybe around data analysis, event scheduling, and so on. But as you go up, well, let's first of all go up directly from that to things like that are maybe not that relevant to you, but highly ambiguous. They have things like movie recommendations, apparently, and music preferences, where there's a lot of judgment, but maybe you're fine taking that recommendation. And then we're least comfortable, they think, in the top right-hand corner with creative intelligence, hiring and firing employees, poetry, creative acts like that, potentially. Again, you can argue about the effectiveness of this framework, but I think it's a good way of trying to understand why people be more or less comfortable. And that means that challenges can vary by sector as well. In very broad terms, you can see differences potentially between, say, high status professions, where they may be feeling a sense of threat to their status and self-image from AI, which leads to psychological reactance, which means you avoid AI. You restructure your job to minimize contact with it. If you're in a big bureaucracy with lots of compliance aspects, you may fear breaking rules using AI, or it may be too difficult because of all the barriers in the way for using it. And then you may be looking at trying to reduce that friction, remove those barriers. And then you may be in a space where you're talking about knowledge workers like marketing, HR consultants, where maybe they're using AI, but there's the issue of satisficing, where you just kind of stop with something that's kind of good enough and don't go further to that deeper adoption. And some interesting studies show that it really varies how you feel about your career in terms of how you react to AI. So people with a clear sense of their career actually seem to feel more in control of their career after using AI, and people with an unclear sense of it feel less in control. So there's an interesting distinction here. There are also nuances, which I won't go into this webinar, at a kind of personal level in terms of people's attitudes to AI. And so the result can be that many organizations are rethinking adoption. So, for example, we see in some of the latest data that the AI adoption rate is trending down for large companies. That there's a gap between the employee usage informally and uninformally. So there's a rise of what's called shadow AI, for example, people using AI outside official kind of channels compared to what has actually been officially sanctioned. So you also see issues potentially where a lot of people saying that there's no real change in the immediate term or no real benefit. Now, of course, some people are saying there's benefit here, and this is a survey of chief financial officers. But I think there's an interesting question under the surface here of what is impeding progress, and it comes to that question of human side of things, and that's what the Wharton School also concluded, that remains the bottleneck and a key potential accelerant. So without deliberate design, things are going to fail. So in terms of then insights from AI, what can we potentially do about some of this stuff? The first thing to say is that there is there's a lot of research that's been done in a general sense about technologies and how they adopt it. It would be strange not to mention that there are many insights that have existed for some time about technology, and some people indeed think that we should be considering AI like any other technology, and that we get distracted from ideas about superintelligence and so on. But actually, we can think about it as a technology which is adopted in like any other route, and there are some famous theories that talk about this, and some of the insights there are still relevant. In terms of how we think about it, we see that there are three main factors that are influencing adoption. So one is, do you see a clear, reasonable, desirable reason to use AI? So your motivation. Do you understand why it might benefit you or your organization? Then there's issue around capability. Are you able to use AI effectively and confidently? And then trust. How do you feel about it? Do you see it as a threat to your perceived competence, or do you kind of welcome it? Do you feel positively towards it? we often talk about capability, motivation, opportunity. We think we've adapted it here for trust because we think that given the novelty of the technology, trust is particularly important here. And these factors can, broadly speaking, explain many of the barriers to adoption, the reasons why people are not adopting AI. You can see up the top this data from Gallup. People don't see why it's valuable. They are worried about privacy or compliance concerns. They lack the right knowledge and training. And if you look specifically at people who say who don't use AI, the first reason they give is they don't believe it can assist in the work they do, and they may be correct, of course. But then you also see all the factors can be explained in terms of these trust and capability ideas as well. In the report that we did, we try and set it out like this. We try and show that there are barriers at each stage when we're moving from no adoption to shallow adoption and from shallow adoption to deep adoption. And these barriers can be understood in terms of motivation, trust, and capability. And there are various behavioral factors that are relevant at each of these stages. I'm actually not going to go through them all right now and give kind of a linking each solution to a barrier, because I think that would be too much and take too long. Instead, I'm going to give you a highlight of 7 to 8 things that you may want to think about that may be useful and relevant in this journey of adoption. So the first thing to think about is social norms. And we often talk about social norms in behavioral science, but there is evidence that they can make a difference here. So there are studies showing that you can actually highlight that other people have used an AI chatbot successfully without issues, and this changes people's views. So people do listen to the others, and they do need a signal sometimes that people are using it to try it themselves. That may be enough, by the way, to go from no to shallow adoption, but maybe not to go further. So the study showing that that does make a difference. It also makes a difference if you flag that most people are doing this thing. People are more likely to use an algorithm when making stock price forecasts when they're told that most other people had also used that algorithm. And then, I'm sorry, there's an error there. It should be around regret. I should say regret aversion. There's some really interesting data around regret as well. So there's a concept in behavioral science called anticipated regret, where you think about how you're going to feel if you don't do something. And the evidence is that people anticipate much greater regret if they're making a decision to use AI or not that goes against what they think is the group norm. So if the human expertise is the dominant, and you use AI and it fails, you're going to feel much more anticipated regret about that possibility than if everyone's doing it and it fails. So social norms are really important here, as in many behaviors, and particularly when things are developing quickly. Loss aversion. There's a really interesting study about how you frame the use and the benefits of AI. So in this study, people were asked to complete a task with or without either human or AI assistance. And they were this task was presented in 2 different ways. In the gain frame, participants were rewarded for each correct answer. And if that was the case, they showed a strong bias for human help, even when the AI was shown to be more accurate in this task. But if there was a loss frame and participants started with $10 and lost money for each mistake, they actually valued the superior AI assistance just as much as the human assistance. So this leads to the potential takeaway that framing AI as a tool to prevent errors or mitigate risk, rather than just a tool to achieve gains, can make people more willing to adopt it. So that kind of loss aversion of what am I preventing happening by using AI versus this is all great, you're going to gain so much from it, is also worth considering. Giving people a sense of agency, and not just a sense, a real agency seems to also make a big difference. So some very obvious things here about personalizing your experience with AI can reduce the kind of psychological reactions by providing more control. This is a concept that is known in other forms of technology and other forms of change management. But the way in which you have the personalization, is also more effective if it's agreed with employees, like deciding or determining what would make the difference, what kind of personalization people want, is a very important step. And indeed, people have shown there to be benefits to involving users in deciding what their job should look like in an AI future. This kind of idea of job crafting, actively saying how your job can and should and will change. But of course, there's a need to make that job crafting positive. So you're looking for ways to expand your role and take on new things rather than kind of digging a moat and insulating you from AI so you don't have to use it. But that kind of involvement in how your job will look in the future seems to really make a difference for people's willingness to use it. Similarly, structured opportunities for use. So getting involved, getting input from people seems to make a big difference. There's an argument that organizations should be using innovation tournaments, rewarding experimentation with AI. So you try and change that idea of innovation and AI just being for a few creative people, but you actually, in a structured way, encourage it across the organization and then get various suggestions about how AI can be used, and then they are brought into a central part. So that's an idea that has been talked about quite a bit. Similarly, sandboxes, so dedicated and safe spaces where people are given the explicit opportunity to experiment with AI in their work for purposes they decide, so they can actually get a sense of agency about how it would work for them. Of course, there are various things that have to be in place for people to actually do this, because it's the kind of thing that'll get squeezed out. But providing that signal as well, that you can use this for things that actually benefit you, rather than it being imposed on you, seems to really make a difference. And some organizations seem to have found success in that sandbox approach. Something we talk about in behavioral science quite a bit is scaffolding. So you don't expect people to jump straight away from one task to from nothing to deep adoption. You try and structure and support it at each stage. And that's an obvious idea around starting with the lower risk and immediate value options, and then building on that to get to the next stage where you use AI in a more complex way. So scaffolding is the concept. How do you do this? I mean, at the very start, you may be looking at removing barriers to the simplest uses. We ran some experiments showing that simply making chatbots more prominent in a public sector setting means people are much more likely to use them, because the barriers and the friction are reduced. And that can be the way to get that first step into using some form of AI, even if it's very simple, making it easy. We talk about this quite a bit, reducing those barriers. But then also, as you go on through this journey, there is some research from Microsoft. Again, some caveats here, because I've only seen this in one study and it sounds suspiciously neat, but I think the basic principle around a tipping point may be true here. So they seem to think from their data in Copilot that when you start getting to a world where there are 11 minutes of daily time savings for people start noticing that, and they start getting into a positive feedback loop where they think, okay, this actually does something for me, and I'm going to use it more. Similarly, they think that 11 weeks of consistent use is the point at which people become familiar with Copilot enough to actually enjoy it or feel like it is truly valuable. So then the question is, how do we help people to that point where it flips and you get into a world in which you see the benefits yourself? When is that point? You may be able to discover this by looking at the data in terms of usage. But then the goal should be to try to get into a self-sustaining or habitual pattern out that difficult first state. And it seems that it is discontinuous. There is a leap that happens at various points. And then if you are, if there are uses of AI in your organization, evaluation and experimentation isn't just a question of finding out more data. It is actually also a powerful potential driver of adoption. If you can show the difference that is made in your organization in terms of numbers, that can convince people are more skeptical. But also, it can show that if something doesn't work, now, yes, people may seize on that saying, oh, it's all hype, but it can also, if dealt with in the right way and presented in the right way, address the issue that people feel like, yes, sometimes not everything works with AI. And that means that we can trust it more when there are some results that show improvements. That kind of sense, a sort of skeptical trust, seems really important, particularly in a world in which there are so many claims for AI all the time. Experiments and showing that some things don't work can actually be helpful. And this is possible. Companies are running large-scale experiments that sometimes show counterintuitive results. So the study on AI recruiting, led by Brian Chiberian at Chicago, it was quite surprising. They found that AI-led interviews were actually better for the people being recruited. And this was an experiment run at scale in a large organization, which shows it can be done. And it was very valuable because it worked out what was and wasn't working and the degree of improvement. And then in terms of leaders, like this is something that I can't avoid talking about because it's really very important. In behavioral science, we sometimes talk about this idea of modeling behaviors. So, demonstrating that you do this behavior yourself as a leader. We know messengers are really important, and people are sensitive to whether their manager is using AI. So the Gallup data shows that they found that manager support actually had the strongest association between, the strongest association with how people use and value AI. So if people strongly agree their manager actively supports the team's use of AI, they're 2.1 times as likely to use AI a few times a week or more. The issue is that not many organizations think that their manager actively supports its use. Just 28% in that data. So again, really important focus there is, what are people saying about it in your organization? Are the behaviors of managers actually backing up some of the rhetoric and the enthusiasm around AI that may be coming from the top? So those are the factors I wanted to highlight to you: social norms, loss aversion, personalization, concept of scaffolding, the tipping points, the importance of valuation, and the importance of leaders. In terms of how you actually do some of this stuff, I mean, there are various tools that can be used from the world of behavioral science. I'm going to just very briefly talk about a couple of them in conclusion. So at the highest level, we may be talking about this three-stage process of diagnose, design, and deepen. So diagnosing is, identifying what is the particular goal of AI adoption in your organization, drawing on those concepts I mentioned around what is it being used for, what is adoption for you, what are the barriers, what type of employees, what profession are you in, because this will really affect the barriers. How can we practice that design approach in terms of scaffolding the behaviors? How can we do the co-creation and the ownership? How can we test them? And then in terms of deepen, how can we find out what's going on? How can we take those practices further? And how can we look at the unintended consequences that may be coming out from AI use? So there are various things you can do here around, looking at the friction in your organization through something called a sludge audit. What are the hidden barriers preventing AI? Can you work out how exactly the different relationships in your organization are impeding or supporting AI? How are the informal uses of AI spreading throughout your organization? And therefore, where are you best placed to focus your efforts? Designing, this is a process we do quite a lot for various kinds of interventions, looking at how we can rapidly prototype things and try them on a small scale, and then getting reactions from employees with that lens of, what is likely to influence behavior based on what we know from the literature, many of the insights I just mentioned there. And then try to work out what impacts it's having and how can we use it in practice, not just coming up with a solution that is static, because AI is developing so quickly. So how can we assess what actually returns it's giving in terms of how people are adopting it and human behavior, but also what is it backfiring in some way? We still don't really know how exactly some of these technologies will play out in organizations because they are so new. And we're very aware that focusing just on a single indicator can cause problems. So that's the three-stage process that we can use. I've given you sort of an overview of what adoption is and what AI is and the different insights from behavioral science. And I'm really interested in sort of the discussion, the questions you may have. And here are contact details. Thanks so much. Okay, so questions. The role of neuroscience, yes. Do I think organizations designing AI rollouts should more explicitly account for how the brain? Well, so I think yes and no. So I think on the one hand, that is important because you obviously care about how people feel. And I think neuroscience can be useful in terms of understanding why people feel a particular way, the kind of reactions they have, through that kind of diagnostic side of it, of the particular functions of the brain seem to be relevant here. But at the end of the day, I would say that the interventions you're talking about are ones that focus on behavior, and they're all kind of external. The way of addressing some of these issues, I think, will draw on findings that aim to influence human behavior, and are less around kind of the neuroscientific approach. So I feel yes in terms of diagnosis and understanding, but it gets less relevant when you actually get into the space of what you want to do about this issue. I mean, neuroscience actually is obviously really interesting and useful in terms of AI, because much of the technology of generative AI is based on neural networks and the way that the brain makes sense of concepts. And we talk about that in the report in terms of adoption and augmenting AI. Let me see the people are with. So I can send the actual study here that I was talking about. So this is one where they have a sense of their future as well. They have a sense of like what they want to do with their career. Was people who are less sure saw it as more of a threat. So it wasn't so much job security as such. It was more kind of the idea of clarity about the future and the plan they had, or sense of their career in the future. So yeah, I don't. For my memory of this is not actually about your specific immediate job security, although that the two may influence each other, obviously. I can put the link in the chat about which study that was. So how people are predicting social norms around using AI. So this is a great question. I think from what I've seen, there can be a tendency for people who feel negatively about it to seek out data that people aren't using it. I think sometimes there is an element of like motivated cognition. Like if you decided at some point it's all hype and none of this is kind of real and it's all going to fade away, then there is an element of like confirmation bias looking for that. And you see that in experts as well. Like in the field of developing AI, people who've been skeptical have stuck to that view quite often, and people who don't want to see the evidence that the people are adopting or not adopting it seems to be true. So I think what can happen is that you get an initial take on AI, perhaps through using it yourself at one point, and maybe you're disappointed or you're enthusiastic, and that kind of shapes your future, the future information you seek out. So if you think that it's all rubbish and going to be a failure, then you'll notice the information is saying that hardly anyone's using it, because that is potentially helpful to you. So that's my take on how people are thinking about social norms. I think there can be a sense, though, in general, that people think that everyone's using it and then have a sense of anxiety that they're not. And that can be actually very unhelpful if they're in a position where they have no capability or no capability or opportunity to actually use AI. So I think that can also be a problem that's going on right now. People are overestimating, and there's kind of what we call pluralistic ignorance, where you think everyone thinks a certain thing was using a certain thing, and everyone else is, and that may not be true. What are reflections if you want to discourage adoption? Oh, sure. How, like, when people use them, we don't want to use it. This is really, really hard because so I teach a course at University of Pennsylvania, and I think in general, universities are struggling with this incredibly. So I think you're right. Banning it is kind of really difficult as an option because there are benefits to it. I think we just have to be creative about other ways of assessing the thing we were looking to assess. So something I started doing was not having restrictions on AI, but if you produce an essay, you have to defend it in class. So you have to actually respond to questions in the moment about the thing you wrote. And obviously, if you didn't write it, then that is obvious. You have to do this in a sensitive way, so to avoid sort of targeting people. But I think increasingly there are ways of thinking about trying to assess the thing that you want to assess without in ways that cannot be influenced by AI. It is known that there are technologies that allow you to fake online interviews as well. So I think what happens, excuse me, it's got very quiet all of a sudden. What can happen is that we move to a world in which we focus on certain tasks and certain in-person activities that are difficult to fake, but also we try and be more specific about the creative use of AI. So I'm going to teach a new course where I say to people, we want you to use AI creatively. We want to use it, but it needs to be clear what your contribution has been, and you need to explain that. And that kind of takes it out of the hidden space into one where it's more normalized, and we try and work out what is that balance between your individual contribution and the AI system. Yes, this is a great question. So it's really hard to answer this one because we're still in the early stages. I do think it's a reason for concern, because, well, I think it's a reason for concern if there are certain practices you want to sustain, because there are different views on this. So one view is the kind of extended mind hypothesis, where it's like all technology, like we shouldn't see intelligence as being just contained within ourselves, but it should be distributed through different technologies. So the way we use them is intelligence in itself. But I'm not fully convinced by that, because I do think that there is an issue potentially around, for example, writing. There is evidence that the act of reading and writing seems to have certain helpful effects, both in individual cognition, but also in society. And if we are less able to do that because we don't do it so much, that is a problem. We do know that obviously neural pathways are reinforced through repeated associations, repeated actions. So I do think it is a concern. That's really the real caveats that we don't know enough in terms of in what way it's a concern yet, because the data is quite unreliable. So, for example, the MIT study that everyone talks about, in terms of, you might have seen on LinkedIn the various parts of the brain lighting up or dampening down with use of ChatGPT. That was a really small study. It was kind of flawed in many ways. That doesn't mean that the conclusion was wrong, but we just need to be a bit careful. I think there are theoretical reasons to be concerned. There are also ways which you might think, therefore, about how you're going to sustain some forms of existing activities when you adopt AI. So I've often seen these kind of approaches where you don't abandon activity completely just so you keep your ability to perform it. You just do it less often, and you do it in a less intensive way. So you might still have to write emails every so often, so you can, to ensure you can still do it. And I think that's a mitigation that's possible. So I think they're probably not recognizing that need enough. And again, that's because there is a lag here, quite often, between technology and the responses. So I think that a lot of the stuff that I just mentioned should be considered more in organizations in terms of how people are actually feeling about AI. And I think we should understand in a more sophisticated way how that interacts with your professional identity. I also think that we should have a kind of understanding approach. So it's not just like, why are people not adopting this wonderful thing? But understanding that sometimes the concerns about reliability are real. Sometimes people have genuine concerns which are not addressable, and there are flaws in AI systems. So I think there should be a dialogue there. And I think we should tease out the concerns that are justified and the ones that are through misperceptions or through concern that is not justified. So I think there are reasons to be concerned sometimes. I'm not saying AI is a panacea, but I think what we're not doing is understanding why people have those concerns, what's driving them, and how we can respond sensitively to them. I generally think we're lacking in that. So interesting question. What should have the right to an AI-free workspace? I mean, there's a question there more generally about what are the rights, but I think you can think about this in terms of also the benefits. So some tasks and some questions maybe are less directly affected by AI, and that's easier for it to be true. So some craft-based industries where the whole point is you're working in the action yourself is really important. So, I mean, this is a question, I think, around any kind of workplace requirement or technology. Do you make a requirement? To what extent? I think if you impose it, there are backfire effects with reactants, with people seeing it as something that is not for them, but for management with an agenda. So I would say it's better to create the conditions and try and make the case rather than making it an imposition. I don't think you should have a right to an AI-free workspace, because I think that should just be a question between you and an employer, frankly. Okay, so I've been told that we should wrap up around now. I want to thank you so much for your time today. This is a rapidly evolving area. So it's actually harder to answer questions because there are new studies coming out all the time. This is just a snapshot of what we've found, and hope you found some of the lessons useful and help you think about how you could apply them to your own workspaces and your own organizations. Thank you so much. And I apologize for the sun coming out all of a sudden. It means you can't see me. Okay, thank you.